will move on to our next presenter. Our next presenter is Elisabeth Davis. Elisabeth, you wanna, there we go. Okay, and hi, it's so nice to see you. And all of our guests, please keep in mind that you are the person who is in charge of your own screen view. If you want to go up to the top, upper right-hand corner of your screen, you have a couple of choices for how to view this, and you can click on speaker view, and that will make the picture that Elisabeth is in bigger, so you can see it. I believe, Elisabeth, I believe your mentor was Dr. Long, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, is Dr. Long here? Don't know. I don't think he's here at the moment, but are you ready to begin?
Sure.
Okay.
How do I share the screen?
So go down to the bottom, look at the bottom, and you're going to see a little button that says share screen, a little green button.
Perfect. Okay.
You see it? Okay, click that, and then just click on the picture of the screen that you'd like to share.
Got it.
Okay, great. Oh, and there's Dr. Long. Hi, Dr. Long. I will be asking you to say a few words for Elisabeth at the end of her presentation. And if all of you would just type any questions that you have into the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little bubble that says chat, and you can type any questions in there, and I will read them aloud at the end, and Elisabeth can take questions. Okay, Elisabeth, how's it coming? Were you able to share your screen? Uh-oh. Did we lose Elisabeth? Uh-oh, I think we may have lost her. We are definitely exploring the outer limits of what we can do with Zoom these days, and finding all, no problem, you got back in, good job.
Oh, it says host disabled. Oh, I'm no longer a co-host, my apologies.
Oh, okay, let me make you a co-host. Oh, because you got back on. Okay, got it. Okay, make a co-host. See if that works.
It should. Yes. Thank you. Okay.
Excellent. Look at that. Wonderful.
Great. Okay. Oops. Sorry about that. I don't know how technology works, even though I did a...
I keep telling all my classes that we are both building the maze and trying to find our way through it at the same time. So we're all right there with you.
Good to hear. All right. So my name is Elisabeth Davis. Thank you for being here this afternoon. I'm going to be sharing my thesis research on state budget appropriations to emergency disaster response and its relationship to gubernatorial election cycles. So while natural disasters are not in any way a phenomenon, the world is seeing unprecedented numbers and severity of disasters in connection to climate change. These disasters are increasing in costs and losses of life and property. And in 2019, the United States experienced $14 billion disasters, which are natural disasters with costs exceeding $1 billion. And in total, in 2018 and 2019, the total cost of natural disasters in the United States exceeded $136 billion total. The question that this begs us to ask is, where is this money coming from, and what are the factors that influence how much money goes towards disaster response? So this represents all of the 2019 billion-dollar weather and climate disasters in the United States. There's a cluster in the southern area. So of particular interest are the states in the southern United States for my research, because they are subject to high numbers of storms, flooding, and hurricanes and other natural disasters due to coastal erosion, the effects of manufacturing and oil, and other climate change, climatic causes. Therefore, for this research, I focus on 12 states designated as the South by the United States Census Bureau. These states are Alabama, Arkansas, Delaware, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Maryland, and Tennessee. Some of those are not states that I typically would think of as Southern, so I thought that was quite interesting. I'm also seeking to include Texas, Florida, and Kentucky, but I'll discuss that later. So government is established and maintained by the people in order to serve the populace. So when disaster strikes, governments are the primary source for support for localities. Financially, it's crucial and appropriate for effective assistance to be afforded to the constituents that the political figures represent. However, political figures are also often having the added pressure and desire of seeking re-election to political office, possibly complicating their objectivity. So for my research, I am specifically asking, how does proximity of time to gubernatorial elections influence state funding for disaster response? I want to understand the relationship between election cycles for the highest state political official and appropriations that these governors approve for disaster response. I'm hypothesizing that state legislatures will appropriate more funds to disaster response in years closer to governor's elections because it is in the electoral interest of the governor. So I will now cover some important research and concepts that I've been considering while doing my research. To begin, what is the significance of researching gubernatorial elections? So significant research has been done on the influence of presidential and congressional funding on election outcomes. For example, the impact of federal spending on House election outcomes by Levitt and Snyder in 1995 was an influential study that found a high correlation between increased federal spending and voter shares for incumbents, the political official that is rerunning for election, leading to a further area in this line of inquiry. In the case of natural disaster response, the majority of funding is federally sourced for states. So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, administers public assistance grants and other resources that typically make up the vast majority of funding that goes towards states' individual emergency management budgets. This has had a lot of research done towards it. However, there is still a gap in the research on states' individual general revenue funding other than outside of federal funding that they're getting from FEMA and the national government. So as I was saying, there is a lack of research into the smaller funding that state governments allocate themselves to general revenue of the state. While the budget is created through state legislative branches, the governor's legislative agenda is a vital part of the governing body's budget creation. Governors submit budget recommendations and budget bills must be signed by governors in order to pass. Most states provide governors with the power to line item veto the budget bill, which allows governors to veto individual lines of the bill while still passing the budget itself. As the only state political official representing all residents in a state, the governor theoretically represents the interest of all of the state and is the image that the government of the state projects. Being that the state budget applies to all citizens, this connection between governor and budget is undeniable. So some of the relevant concepts for this research is the idea of election-induced disaster support, which was brought up by Klomp in a 2019 and 2020 study entitled Election or Disaster Support, which describes the influence of upcoming elections on funding for disaster-related infrastructure in the government. He found that national governments will spend 10% more on disaster recovery within 1 year of an election. This was especially seen in countries that are majoritarian, have a presidential system and high free access to media, as well as a short history of democracy. The United States meets the first 3 of these criteria, which has been interesting in leading to further research. One example of this election-induced disaster support is seen in studies done on the disaster declaration request process in the United States. So in order for the federal government to provide assistance to states a disaster declaration must be issued by the president. In the case of a major disaster, a state government may request the state governor may request a disaster declaration from the president. And there's evidence to suggest that both presidents and governors use this process to their advantage. Garrett and Sobel found that presidential flood declarations are greater in years that the president is running for a re-election. And they state that at the presidential level, the president will declare disaster in states more critical to his or her re-election. And in addition to this, over half of all disaster relief they find to be possibly politically motivated. This is particularly seen in politicians without term limits, particularly governors without term limits, leading for the line of thought that this could be very much tied to the desire to be reelected into political office. So the third major concept that kind of brings this research together is the idea of a political budget cycle, which is defined as the opportunistic financial policy passed for electoral gains. This idea was popularized by Rogoff and Seibert in 1998. And this idea has been finding that there is an intention to secure re-election by maximizing the incumbent's expected vote share at the next election, and that the political budget cycle is used as a means to gain this. So moving on to the methodology of my research. So the process that I followed was originally determining the primary disaster departments and agencies for each state, then determining yearly general revenue appropriations to these aforementioned departments or agencies, connecting fiscal years to governor's election dates, and analyzing the correlation between final appropriations and political budget cycle. So in all of this, there's a lot that needs to be considered. While there are many paths of functionally funding disaster relief, including directing money to public safety, disaster mitigation, public health programs, each state government has a primary agency tasked in immediate disaster response. This is typically a department or agency of emergency management. In Texas, it's called the Texas Department of Emergency Management. These agencies and departments fall under different higher offices, including state military departments, departments of public safety, homeland security, or the executive office of the governor. In order to isolate funding directly correlated to the governor's agenda, theirs themselves, I separated funding allocated to disaster response departments from state general revenue and federal programming and grants. So I'm only addressing funding directly deposited from the state and not from the federal government. So for my research, I did not include any FEMA grants, federal funding from disaster declarations, or special funds. By strictly analyzing money directly allocated from the state's general public budget, I could minimize confounding variables outside of the relationship between governors and their state and this possible desire for re-election. In addition to this, state budgets are passed to cover a fiscal year rather than a calendar year. And in all of the states included in this study, the fiscal year begins on June 13th every year, except for Alabama, where it begins on September 30th. So the gubernatorial elections between 2010 and 2019 were inputted according to their respective fiscal years, as well as budgeting in order to best represent the time that the budget overlaps with election. In addition to this, I have currently included 12 of the 15 southern states, according to the census. However, Texas, Florida, and Kentucky provide their budget data for disaster emergency management departments online differently, and so I'm still working on including this in my data. So when it comes to the results, this right here represents the overall general revenue appropriations for primary disaster response agencies in these states from the years 2010 to 2019. So we can see some states have more linear response, some states change given in different years, but it's hard to understand from this alone the correlation that it has with election cycles. So when we look at states individually, on these charts, I'm specifically pointing red dots as election years, and yellow dots as the year directly before an election year. So without analyzing them all together and analyzing them individually, we can see just by looking at it that there is something interesting about the placement of funding in these years with markings versus non-markings. Some states, it seems a little bit less like it might follow this. Some states in other directions. This is Virginia. This is Georgia, which looks like it's taking just a general increase approach. However, when because I'm still collecting the data for some of these states and still observing them, what I'm finding so far, however, has been supporting my hypothesis, which is that during an election year, more than a fourth of the share of budget financing is going towards the disaster response in that year rather than in years farther away from elections. What it looks like here is that only about 20%, if we take the total average disaster appropriations for all of the states included by type, is being allocated during the 2 years that are not prior to an election. So why is this all important? If there is evidence to show states engaged in election-induced disaster support, it can be a small indication of greater influence within the larger system of government, and for human psychology and political science, what the influence of a desire to be reelected does for constituents and does for funding. This kind of research will help us better understand how we can respond to disasters, and it allows us to foster objectivity for best policy instead of relying on partisan desires and personal politician motives for getting into office. The accountability is really important. Accountability is really important in government and in funding, and so we need to understand where the flaws are in order to start to hold people accountable for them. So further research that I think is important is studies accounting for the effects of major natural disasters on funding. I have not adjusted for years in which a major natural disaster occurs in a state and the influence that that might have on election funding. There's evidence to suggest that this could have a major influence on the political budget cycle and electoral benefits or consequences for incumbents. More research that is important is covering other types of disaster relief, response, and mitigation funding separate from the state's most primary department or agency for emergency management. There are many other types of grants and areas of government that go into promoting mitigation and trying to solve disaster recovery issues. It's also important to cover other regions of the United States and possibly more localized regions within a state. And it is vital that we continue to find the change in appropriation and election cycles as it goes throughout the 21st century, and we experience more issues of climate change and the further expansion of natural disasters. So these are some of my references.
All right, wonderful. Do you want to remove share? Oh. So unshare your screen.
Yes.
Quite all right, we're figuring it out. And if everybody wants to unmute yourselves and show up on video to give Elisabeth a big hand. Yay!
Yay! Elisabeth!
That was wonderful. That was wonderful. Yeah, Elisabeth is another student that I had the opportunity to work with in thesis prep. So I kind of saw this idea evolve and love where it ended up. Dr. Long, would you like to say a few words?
Certainly. I have to say I admire this project for two reasons. First, a lot of political science research can sometimes be rather esoteric, and so you wonder how does it connect to people's real lives. And as somebody who loves politics, I've always felt that the best research is research that really does have an impact on where people live. And so, you know, if you think about this topic in Elisabeth, you know, her home state of Louisiana, and then the state where she's studying, Texas, those are states with Katrina and Harvey that have obviously been impacted by severe natural disasters. And we as citizens need to know those who are overseeing these disasters, are they doing so in an objective, kind of logical manner, or are there personal political ambitions there at play? And so I thought it was a provocative research topic. And when she told me exactly what she wanted to do, I knew it was going to be ambitious. I think we're all learning from the pandemic, of people who may not be political junkies like we are, but people are now learning from the pandemic that our federal system of government makes things very complicated. It's not just, it's not a unitary government where you can just go to Washington, D.C. and everything is done there. We have 50 autonomous state governments. And so for Elisabeth to take on the challenge of having to go out and get data from all of these states that have different bureaucratic structures and different organizations, I mean, that I knew it was going to be a tough research project. But I also knew, because I've had Elisabeth in a couple of my classes, that she has a first-rate intellect and that she would be up to the challenge. And I really didn't have to do very much, quite honestly. I gave her a little guidance here or there, but she knew what she wanted to do. She took the reins and she's pulled it off brilliantly. So I just want everybody to know, you know, that this was an ambitious project, particularly to try to do it in a semester, and then with all the upheaval of having to go online and and do things virtually. And for her to do such a tremendous job, I'm just very, very impressed.
Thank you so much. Both of you have been such a wonderful support to me this year. I really appreciate it.
You know, you hear professors and teachers say that it's a privilege to work with students. Genuinely, we really mean that, and it is definitely a privilege.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay. Does anybody have questions for Elisabeth? You can type them into your into the chat function down at the bottom of your screen. You'll see that there's a little chat bubble, and you can ask any questions. I'll start with one of my own. As Dr. Long brings up the current pandemic situation, Elisabeth, do you see any crossover with natural disaster management and this pandemic response?
Oh, sorry, it kind of cut out. I couldn't hear you.
Okay, we try again. Okay. So, as Dr. Long mentioned, that this is a particularly interesting topic during you know, the 100-year pandemic situation that we're currently in. Did you see overlap and parts of your research that could be used and sort of modeled for a pandemic?
So I definitely saw, as I was finding the different funding for each year, without even knowing when different kind of disasters happened, I could see the influence in where the money was going. And because this has happened so recently, I didn't get to see any of the pandemic in that research, but I found very interesting that almost all of the emergency management departments, when I was gathering research or gathering data from their websites or their files, they had plastered all over the website COVID information and different kind of ideas and plans for how to deal with that and what they are trying to do with that. So I think that would be really interesting to see in the upcoming 5 to 10 years how this plays into that. But right now, I'm not exactly sure.
Well, nobody's sure about anything right now, right? So certainly that this will be a fertile field for political scientists going forward.
Definitely.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much, Elisabeth. And I believe our next presenter is Dominic Del Fiero. Is Dominic with us?